It began with ships, massive steel-bellied vessels cutting through the Atlantic, filled with tired faces and calloused hands. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians left their homeland in search of a better life. They fled hunger, war and oppression, leaving behind the arid lands of Sicily, Calabria and Naples, where corruption was as common as the dust in the air. When they arrived at Ellis Island, they carried little more than dreams and the unspoken code of survival they had learned back home. What none of them could imagine was that, on the crowded streets of New York, those same codes would transform into the foundation of an empire of crime that would one day control an entire city. At first, the immigrants were merely survivors. They found themselves in tenement buildings in neighborhoods like Little Italy, East Harlem and Brooklyn, packed into dark, narrow rooms where disease and desperation thrived. Employers exploited them, politicians ignored them, the police harassed them. In the face of such hostility, Italian families turned inward, relying on their own. They recreated what they knew, small networks of trust, loyalty and silence. It was not called the Mafia yet, but the seeds were there, protection, respect and power earned through fear. In Sicily, the mafiosi had long existed as protectors, at least in theory. They were men who stepped in where the law did not reach, offering justice and safety to the powerless in exchange for obedience. But when this culture crossed the ocean, it mutated. In the New World, there were no vineyards to guard or landlords to challenge. There were crowded alleys, black markets, and new opportunities for control. By the dawn of the 20th century, small Sicilian gangs began forming in New York's boroughs. Each was local, territorial and loyal only to their own village or family. There was no unified organization yet, only fragments of something larger, something waiting to be born. These early groups thrived in the cracks of society. They ran protection rackets on Italian-owned businesses, collected debts and punished betrayal with knives or bullets. Most Americans viewed them as savages, but among Italian immigrants, they were often seen as necessary evils, the only ones who could protect them from exploitation. The police spoke little Italian. The courts treated immigrants as lesser beings. If someone stole your wages, you didn't call the cops. You went to the man everyone feared, the man who could make things right for a price. And thus, the mafia in America was not just born from greed, but from need. By the 1910s, one event would change everything: prohibition. The United States outlawed alcohol, but people's thirst didn't disappear. Suddenly, an immense black market emerged, and for those who knew how to move in the shadows, it was like striking oil. Italian gangs, along with Irish and Jewish mobs, seized the opportunity. Bootlegging became the engine of a new criminal economy. The money was staggering, and with money came power. Small-time street enforcers became businessmen overnight, running networks that stretched from the docks of Manhattan to speakeasies in Chicago. Among them, a young Sicilian named Salvatore Lucania, who would soon be known to the world as Charles Lucky Luciano. But before Luciano could reshape the underworld, the streets had to run red. Rival factions of Sicilian immigrants began fighting for control of territory, extortion, and liquor routes. The air in Little Italy was thick with gunpowder and fear. The murders were personal, often done face to face, a reflection of the Sicilian code that demanded honor be settled in blood. Each neighborhood became a battlefield. Out of these wars emerged figures who would later define an era: Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria, a brutal and arrogant don who demanded tribute from all, and Salvatore Maranzano, a traditionalist from Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, who dreamed of bringing old-world discipline to the American chaos. These early gangsters didn't see themselves as criminals in the modern sense. They considered themselves businessmen, providers of protection, dealers of opportunity. Yet beneath the surface, something darker brewed. Corruption spread like wildfire. Police captains were bribed, judges looked the other way, and politicians accepted envelopes stuffed with cash to ensure cooperation. The underworld and the overworld began to blur. The Italian mafia was no longer just a foreign problem, it was becoming part of the American fabric. By the 1920s, entire industries in New York, construction, docks, food distribution, fell under mafia control. The unions were infiltrated, the workers paid dues for protection, and anyone who refused to comply risked losing more than their job. The mafia didn't just own the streets, it began to own the system itself. For the first time, the families realized they could influence not just neighborhoods, but entire cities. Yet even in their growing power, the old ways of Sicily still governed everything. Loyalty was sacred. Silence was survival. The word omerta, the code of silence, became law. A man who betrayed the family signed his own death warrant. There were no appeals, no forgiveness, only blood-erased dishonor. And while America celebrated its roaring 20s, somewhere in the shadows of Mulberry Street, a new power was consolidating, one that no government or police force truly understood. What made this power so enduring was its invisibility. The mafia did not seek attention, it thrived in whispers. Its members often dressed modestly, ran legitimate front businesses, and appeared as pillars of their communities. They attended church, donated to local charities, and claimed to defend their people. But behind the curtains, they were the architects of extortion, gambling, and murder. To the untrained eye, they looked like any other immigrant family. To those who crossed them, they were the executioners of a new order. And so, by the time the American public began to suspect the scale of what was happening, it was already too late. The mafia was not an imported disease. It had taken root and evolved in the heart of the nation that promised freedom and opportunity. In every corner of New York, from the docks of Brooklyn to the markets of the Bronx, whispers of names carried fear. Power had changed hands, but the methods were ancient. The streets that once welcomed the dreamers of Sicily now belonged to their most ruthless descendants. It was only the beginning. The families were forming, the bloodlines of power were being written, and soon, out of this chaos, one man would rise to reshape it all, to turn crime into an empire and the streets of New York into a kingdom. The year was 1929, and New York was a city of contradictions. The skyline glimmered with ambition, but the streets were soaked in fear. Beneath the bright lights of Broadway and the jazz rhythms of Harlem, an invisible war was unfolding. A war not fought with armies or ideology, but with bullets, loyalty, and betrayal. The immigrants who once came seeking opportunity were now battling for control of an empire built on vice. It would come to be known as the Castellamarese War, the bloodiest internal conflict in the history of the American Mafia. At the center of it stood two titans, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were Sicilian, both were ruthless, and both believed they were destined to rule. Masseria, who rose from the back streets of Lower Manhattan, was loud, brash, and greedy. He demanded tribute from every Italian gangster in the city, calling himself the boss of bosses. His power was rooted in intimidation. Those who refused to pay him either vanished or turned up dead. For years, his reign went unchallenged, but in 1929, a rival appeared, a man who would change everything. Salvatore Maranzano had recently arrived from Castellammare del Golfo, a small coastal town in Sicily. To his followers, he was a man of honor, disciplined, intelligent, and strategic, the opposite of the crude and impulsive Masseria. Maranzano envisioned a return to the old ways, where the mafia would be governed by structure and respect, not greed and chaos. To him, the streets of New York were not just turf, they were territory to be ruled like provinces under a new Roman Empire. As both men expanded their forces, the lines were drawn. Families and crews across the city were forced to choose sides. Friendships shattered overnight. Men who had once shared meals now aimed guns at one another. It was a war fought not only for power, but for ideology, for what the mafia would become in the new world. The Mafia faction was filled with older Americanized gangsters who cared about money above all. The Maranzano side was dominated by traditional Sicilians who believed in restoring order, discipline, and loyalty to heritage. And in the middle of it all was Charles Lucky Luciano, a young, ambitious gangster who refused to be chained by either side. Born in Sicily but raised on the streets of New York, Luciano embodied both worlds. He was fluent in English and Italian, respected by the old-timers, yet admired by the new generation. To many, he was the bridge between the past and the future. To himself, he was destined for something greater. Luciano had started as a small-time hustler, working his way through drug deals, gambling rings, and bootlegging operations during Prohibition. But what set him apart was his vision. He saw beyond ethnicity. While Mafia and Maranzano were consumed by Sicilian pride, Luciano recognized that the future of organized crime in America depended on inclusion and efficiency. He allied himself not only with Italians, but with Irishmen like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Jewish mobsters who shared his business sense and cold pragmatism. Together, they were building something new, a modern criminal corporation. As the Castellamarese War dragged on, bodies piled up across New York. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, and assassinations became routine. Restaurants, barbershops, and street corners turned into killing grounds. The newspapers began to take notice, calling it the Sicilian Blood War, but the police could do little. Witnesses stayed silent, and juries were easily bought. The code of omertà ruled all. No one talked. Everyone feared. For Luciano, the chaos was both an opportunity and a curse. He initially sided with Mafia, seeing in him a chance to climb higher. But the more he watched, the more disgusted he became. Mafia's greed was destroying the organization. His short temper and paranoia alienated his own men. Luciano began to realize that the future couldn't belong to men like him, relics of the old world clinging to outdated notions of honor. What the mafia needed was business, not blood. Quietly, Luciano began negotiating with Maranzano's people. He proposed a peace, a unification of all Italian gangs under one modern structure. But Maranzano was old school. He wanted absolute control. Luciano knew then that the only way forward was through betrayal. To end the war, one king had to fall. On April 15, 1931, the end came. Luciano arranged a lunch meeting with Mafia at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a restaurant in Coney Island. They played cards, drank wine, and laughed as if nothing were wrong. Then, while Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, 4 gunmen entered the room. Shots echoed through the dining hall. When the smoke cleared, Joe the boss lay dead, his ace of spades still clutched in his hand. It was the death of the boss of bosses. The newspapers would later call it the most elegant execution in mafia history. Luciano returned, looked at the body, and said nothing. The war, for all its blood, was finally ending. Maranzano took over as the new leader, proclaiming himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized the mafia into 5 families, each with its own hierarchy of boss, underboss, and capo regime. It was the first real attempt to bring order to the underworld. Yet, for all his talk of structure, Maranzano made one fatal mistake. He underestimated Lucky Luciano. Maranzano still viewed Luciano as a subordinate, a useful soldier in his empire. But Luciano had no intention of being ruled. He saw in Maranzano the same flaws that had doomed Mafia: arrogance and obsession with power. Within months, Luciano made his move again. In September 1931, Maranzano summoned him to his office in the Helmsley building, intending to have him killed. Luciano learned of the plot first. He sent his own men instead, assassins disguised as federal agents. They stormed the office, drew their guns, and riddled Maranzano with bullets. With that, the last of the old world dons was gone. In less than a year, Lucky Luciano had done what no one before him could. He had unified the American Mafia. The days of petty wars and regional feuds were over. From the ashes of the Castellamarese War rose a new order, one based not on Sicilian tradition but on profit, organization, and control. Luciano abolished the title of boss of bosses. No man would ever hold absolute power again. Instead, he formed the Commission, a governing council of the 5 families that would rule collectively, settle disputes, and manage business across the nation. It was, in essence, a government, but a government of shadows. The Castellamarese War had taken hundreds of lives, but it gave birth to a system that would dominate American crime for the next 50 years. And at its center stood a man who understood that fear was temporary, but power, true power, came from structure. Lucky Luciano was no longer just a gangster, he was a visionary. The Kingdom of New York now had its architect, and the Mafia had its new face. Disciplined, corporate, and unstoppable. When Salvatore Maranzano fell, the old world of the Sicilian Mafia in America died with him. The streets of New York went silent for a brief, almost eerie moment. After years of bloodshed, betrayal, and chaos, the city's criminal underworld waited to see what would rise from the ashes. Out of that silence stepped Charles Lucky Luciano, the young mastermind who had outplayed both tyrants and visionaries. But Luciano wasn't content to simply rule. He wanted to build something enduring, a structure so strong that no single man could destroy it again. The time of the boss of bosses was over. The time of the commission had begun. Luciano understood that power in America worked differently than in Sicily. In the old country, the Mafia thrived on family loyalty, blood oaths, and isolation. In America, survival depended on business, efficiency, alliances, and the ability to adapt. Luciano saw that the Mafia could no longer afford endless wars over pride or territory. It needed order, it needed rules, and above all, it needed a system that reflected the new world it inhabited. His vision was not of a gang, but of an organization, one with departments, leadership, and governance, a criminal corporation built on modern principles. In 1931, he called together the heads of the most powerful families across New York and beyond. The meeting was held in secrecy in a quiet hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan. There, with smoke filling the room and armed men guarding the door, Luciano laid out his plan. There would be 5 families, each autonomous but united under a single council. No one would have absolute power, but all would have a voice. This council would be called the Commission. It would function as the governing body of organized crime in America, a hidden parliament in the shadows of the nation's greatest city. The 5 families were defined that day. The Genovese family, named later after Vito Genovese, would control much of Manhattan and the docks, the heart of New York's economy. The Gambino family, under the lineage of Carlo Gambino, would rise to dominate Brooklyn and Long Island. The Lucchese family, led by Tommy Lucchese, would infiltrate labor unions and transportation networks. The Bonanno family, founded by Joseph Bonanno, would hold power in Queens and Brooklyn's Sicilian enclaves. And finally, the Colombo family, originally led by Joseph Profaci and later renamed, would become the youngest but one of the most volatile of them all. Each family operated independently, but the commission was the unifying force. It functioned much like a corporate board of directors. It handled disputes, approved contracts, and sanctioned hits. If one boss wanted to eliminate another, the decision had to go through the commission. This rule prevented unnecessary wars and kept business steady. For the first time, the Mafia had transformed from a collection of warring clans into a coherent institution. Beneath the chaos of the city, a new kind of order was born, one governed not by morality, but by profit. Luciano modeled the system on the American government he had grown up observing. Just as Washington had senators and governors, he gave each family its hierarchy. The boss, the underboss, the consigliere, the capo regimes, and the soldiers. Each level had responsibilities and shared in the earnings. The families were like states, and the commission was the federal government. The mafia, for the first time, became democratic, at least in appearance. Behind closed doors, however, Luciano still pulled the strings. He was the architect and, quietly, the ultimate arbiter of its power. Under this new structure, business thrived. The mafia's reach extended far beyond the streets. They infiltrated labor unions, construction companies, ports, restaurants, and even Hollywood studios. If you wanted to build, ship, or distribute anything in New York, you paid a price to one of the 5 families. Truck drivers, dock workers, and contractors all contributed dues, money that flowed up the chain, filling envelopes that reached the hands of men in tailored suits sitting in smoke-filled rooms. To the public, they were community leaders. To those who knew, they were the real government of the city. Luciano's genius was not just organizational, it was diplomatic. He understood that cooperation meant profit. The commission wasn't limited to New York. It included representatives from Chicago's outfit, led by Al Capone's successor, Frank Nitti, and Buffalo's Stefano Magaddino, among others. In time, the commission became a national network, a syndicate that coordinated gambling, narcotics, extortion, and labor racketeering across the United States. The mafia was no longer just a local menace. It had become an invisible empire. But the brilliance of the commission also lay in its invisibility. It didn't need headlines or recognition. It thrived precisely because it operated under the radar. Luciano instructed his men to keep a low profile. No flashy cars, no public violence, no unnecessary attention. "We're businessmen," he would say. "The cops can't arrest you for making money." The mafia began blending into legitimate industries so well that for decades, law enforcement barely scratched its surface. Judges were bribed, politicians bought, and police departments quietly compromised. New York became a stage, and the commission wrote the script behind the curtain. However, even this perfect system had its cracks. Power, once tasted, is never easily shared. The commission was designed to prevent another war, but it also created a delicate balance that could collapse with a single act of betrayal. Ambition simmered beneath the surface. Some bosses followed Luciano's vision. Others saw themselves as kings in waiting. Yet for nearly 3 decades, the structure held. The mafia thrived, richer and more disciplined than ever before. Meanwhile, Luciano himself would pay the price for his own success. In 1936, after years of investigations, he was convicted on charges of running prostitution rackets, charges he always claimed were politically motivated. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, but even from behind bars, his influence persisted. The commission continued to function exactly as he designed it. It was bigger than any man. That was his legacy. World War II would later bring Luciano back into the fold, when American intelligence agencies secretly enlisted his help to secure New York's docks from Nazi sabotage. A true testament to the strange symbiosis between the mafia and the state. After the war, he was deported to Italy, yet the system he built remained intact, stronger than ever. By the 1950s, the 5 families ruled New York like a silent monarchy. They didn't need thrones or crowns. Their power was measured in silence, fear, and control. The commission was, at its core, an illusion of equality, masking a reality of manipulation. It was the perfect reflection of the world around it, democratic in form, dictatorial in spirit. Beneath the bustling streets of Manhattan, a hidden government thrived, one that answered to no law but its own. And while politicians debated bills and budgets, the commission decided life and death. It was the most efficient criminal organization in history, a kingdom without borders, ruled by men who had mastered the art of invisibility. By the mid-1950s, New York was gleaming. The skyline had risen higher, the economy was booming, and the streets pulsed with ambition. But beneath the rhythm of jazz clubs and Wall Street trading floors, another empire thrived, invisible, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient. The five families had matured. The commission, conceived by Lucky Luciano, was no longer a secret experiment. It was a shadow government, and for decades it ruled with quiet precision. This was the golden age of the Italo-American Mafia, the era when power wore a smile, money flowed like water, and silence became sacred law. Each family had its kingdom. The Genovese family ran Manhattan like a private corporation. Their influence spread from the docks and trucking unions to construction and garbage collection. At the helm stood Vito Genovese, a man as cunning as he was merciless. He was the embodiment of the mafia's evolution, cultured in appearance, ruthless in execution. To the world, he was a businessman. To those who knew better, he was a sovereign ruler. The Genovese family perfected the art of invisibility, laundering dirty money through clean businesses, investing in real estate, and manipulating the labor movement from behind the scenes. Across the East River, the Gambino family, under the quiet and calculating Carlo Gambino, expanded its reach. Gambino was not a man of theatrics. He understood that true power didn't need to shout, it whispered. He built alliances rather than wars, favoring subtle manipulation over violence. Under his leadership, the Gambinos became the richest and most stable of the five families. Every truck that moved goods through New York Harbor, every union that voted on wages, every delivery that reached the city's markets, all passed through his invisible hands. The Gambino family was the muscle and the mind of commerce in America's greatest city. Then there was Tommy Lucchese, the man who turned corruption into an art form. His family, the Lucchese family, became synonymous with organization. He infiltrated the garment district, the airport system, and the city's transport unions. He controlled what people wore, how they traveled, and even how goods were flown across the country. Lucchese's influence reached so far into legitimate industries that the line between crime and business ceased to exist. He understood politics too, maintaining friendships with city officials, police commanders, and even senators. To many, he was untouchable because everyone owed him something. Meanwhile, Joseph Bonanno, the quiet and traditional Don from Castellammare del Golfo, ruled his family with old-world discipline. The Bonanno family was steeped in Sicilian heritage and loyalty. Bonanno saw the mafia as a fraternity, almost spiritual in nature. He despised the arrogance of newer bosses who courted the media or politicians. To him, omertà, the sacred code of silence, was holy. His family operated like a church, bound by ritual and secrecy. Yet beneath that calm exterior, tensions brewed. The old ways and the new ways were beginning to collide. And finally, there was Joseph Colombo, the youngest of the five dons, who brought the mafia into the spotlight. At first, Colombo was seen as an idealist. He even founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League to combat stereotypes against Italians. But his activism drew too much attention. The mafia had always thrived in the dark, not under the glare of television cameras. When Colombo was shot in 1971 at a public rally in Manhattan, it was a brutal reminder of the one unbreakable rule. Those who sought fame in this world of shadows never lived long enough to enjoy it. During this golden age, money became the true measure of power. The families no longer needed to spill blood to prove dominance. They simply bought everything they wanted: judges, politicians, police, and businessmen. The mafia's annual income rivaled that of Fortune 500 companies. Construction contracts, labor deals, garbage disposal, nightclubs, and even the film industry were under their control. When a skyscraper went up in Manhattan, chances were high that a mafia-owned company poured the concrete or supplied the steel. When a shipment arrived at the docks, someone paid a tax to unload it safely. The mafia was everywhere, yet nowhere to be seen. At the heart of this dominance was omertà, the unspoken code that bound every man to silence. To talk was to die. Betrayal was the one sin that could never be forgiven. It was more than just a rule, it was a religion. Sons were taught to keep quiet before they could read. Wives learned to pretend not to notice things. Mothers buried their questions deep. The fear was not theatrical, it was absolute. Entire generations grew up knowing that one word to the wrong person could erase their bloodline. This culture of silence made the mafia untouchable. The FBI could suspect, but it couldn't prove. The courts could indict, but witnesses vanished or forgot. The system worked because it was built on fear, fear that masqueraded as loyalty. Inside this empire, discipline was everything. A made man, a soldier who had taken the oath of blood, was bound to his family until death. He could not retire, could not refuse an order, could not betray his boss. He lived and died by the will of the family. But unlike the chaotic gangs of the 1920s, this was now a business. Murders were planned like boardroom decisions. Hits required approval from the commission. Every death was accounted for, justified, and sanctioned. The streets were cleaner, the crime more efficient. The five families had become the most organized criminal entity in the world. But for all its order, the system depended on illusion. The Dons lived double lives. By day, they attended weddings, baptisms, and funerals, respected men in their communities. By night, they orchestrated extortion, gambling, and murder. Their charm disarmed politicians. Their money silenced journalists. To the outside world, they were ghosts, men who smiled at mayors while burying enemies in concrete. The public fascination only grew. Movies and newspapers romanticized them as anti-heroes. Elegant, loyal, even noble. The truth was far colder. Behind every handshake was a threat. Behind every toast, a deal sealed in fear. And yet within that fear, there was order, an equilibrium that kept New York stable in its own paradoxical way. The mafia's control meant that random street violence declined. Criminals had to ask permission to operate. Even chaos was organized. It was a dark kind of peace, one built on extortion, silence, and respect for the unseen rulers. For 3 decades, the five families operated with surgical precision, and the city prospered under their invisible hand. The police knew it, the politicians knew it, even the federal government knew it, but no one could touch them. The law could chase individuals, but not the system itself. The commission had become too integrated, too subtle, too powerful. It wasn't just a criminal network anymore. It was a culture, a hierarchy, a parallel civilization. The golden age of the mafia was not marked by violence but by control. It was the reign of quiet kings who ruled through silence, strategy, and fear. And while the world above celebrated progress below the surface, New York was already owned, not by mayors or moguls, but by men who had sworn their allegiance in blood. They called it honor. History would call it something else: domination without mercy. By the late 1970s, the empire that had ruled New York from the shadows began to crack. The streets still whispered the names of Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, but the fear that once silenced the city was fading. New forces were rising, not from rival gangs or internal wars, but from the one enemy the mafia had underestimated for decades: the United States government. The invisible kingdom built on silence was about to face the loudest and most relentless adversary imaginable: the FBI. For years, federal agents had tried and failed to dismantle the mafia. Investigations went nowhere. Witnesses disappeared, juries were bought, and the sacred code of omerta kept the truth buried. But by the end of the 1970s, a new generation of lawmen had emerged, men who studied the mafia not as criminals, but as a corporation. They learned its structure, its hierarchy, and its language. They mapped the five families like a corporate chart and discovered that the commission, once mythic, was real. the federal government finally had its blueprint for war. The weapon that changed everything was a single law, the RICO Act, short for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970. For the first time, prosecutors didn't need to prove individual crimes. They could charge entire organizations. If a boss ordered a murder, even indirectly, he could be tried as though he had pulled the trigger himself. What had once been untouchable, the insulated upper echelon of the mafia, was now legally vulnerable. The very structure Luciano had created for stability had become its greatest weakness. Wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover agents became the FBI's new tools. Hidden microphones captured conversations once protected by omerta. Agents listened as mobsters talked about construction deals, union dues, and waste management contracts, euphemisms for extortion, bribery, and murder. Every whispered joke, every careless comment, every coded word became evidence. It was the first time in history that the government could listen in on the inner sanctum of organized crime. The first major blow came in 1981 with the Commission case, led by federal prosecutor Rudolph Giuliani and the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. It was a bold plan. Indict the heads of all 5 families at once, proving that they collectively ran a criminal enterprise that infiltrated nearly every corner of New York's economy. No one had ever dared to touch the commission before. The bosses had always believed they were beyond reach, but when the indictments were unsealed in 1985, the era of untouchables was over. Among those targeted were Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo of the Lucchese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, Anthony Salerno of the Genovese family, and Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family. Castellano, known as the Howard Hughes of the Mafia, saw himself as a businessman, not a gangster. He wore suits, lived in a mansion on Staten Island, and avoided the street-level violence that defined his predecessors. But the new generation of Gambinos, led by the ambitious John Gotti, saw his detachment as weakness. In December 1985, as Castellano stepped out of a limousine in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, a team of assassins gunned him down in broad daylight. The hit was swift, theatrical, and brutal, and it marked the end of an era. Gotti, dressed in silk ties and $1,000 suits, took over the family. The media crowned him the Dapper Don. Cameras followed him everywhere. For the first time, the mafia had a celebrity boss, but Gotti's fame was also his undoing. While he basked in the spotlight, the FBI quietly built its case. The agents targeted Gotti's closest lieutenant, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a man responsible for at least 19 murders. For years, Gravano had lived by omerta, but when faced with life imprisonment, he did the unthinkable. He flipped. In 1991, Gravano became the highest-ranking mafia member ever to turn government witness. His testimony was devastating. He exposed the internal workings of the Gambino family, revealing how meetings were conducted, how profits were divided, and how murders were approved. When the verdict came, John Gotti, the man who once declared himself untouchable, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The floodgates opened. Across New York, informants began to surface. Some were motivated by fear, others by money, others simply by exhaustion. The code of silence that had protected the mafia for a century was crumbling. With every testimony, another wall fell. Wiretaps led to arrests. Bank records led to convictions. One by one, the dons of the Golden Age were taken down, not by bullets, but by evidence. Vito Genovese had died in prison years earlier. Joseph Bonanno, once the traditionalist, had been exiled from the commission after internal betrayal. Carlo Gambino died peacefully in bed, but his successors were not so lucky. Carmine Persico spent the rest of his life behind bars. Tony Ducks was convicted under the commission case and died in prison in 2000. The power that had once seemed eternal had evaporated under fluorescent lights and courtroom oaths. The mafia tried to adapt. The younger generation turned to new businesses, stock manipulation, credit card fraud, drug trafficking. But the golden structure was gone. The commission still existed in name, but its influence had withered. Surveillance made secrecy impossible. Loyalty had become a relic. The FBI, once mocked by gangsters as fools, bumbling and idiots, now dictated the rules. The fall of the Dons was not just a legal victory, it was cultural. America's fascination with the mafia had turned from fear to nostalgia. Movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas romanticized the era of respect and order, but the reality was uglier. By the 1990s, the mafia was no longer the disciplined brotherhood of Luciano's vision. It had become fragmented, paranoid, and vulnerable. Inside the prisons, the old bosses grew old and bitter, replaced by younger men with no code, no restraint, and no sense of honor. The omertà that once defined them had been sold for plea deals and witness protection. The empire that had ruled New York for 50 years collapsed not in fire, but in silence. The same silence it had once used as its greatest weapon. By the dawn of the 21st century, the five families still existed, but their influence was a shadow of what it had been. The docks, the unions, the casinos, all under federal oversight. Their meetings were monitored, their profits tracked. The mafia had survived, yes, but it was no longer a kingdom. It was a ghost, an echo of a time when fear could silence a city and a handshake could seal a man's fate. In the end, the fall of the Dons wasn't the end of crime, but the end of myth. The men who once believed themselves immortal were reduced to numbers in federal files. The golden suits, the fine cigars, the whispered codes, all became artifacts of a dying empire. The commission, once the symbol of invincibility, had been dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but memories and legends. The kingdom of the mafia had fallen, not by the sword, but by its own reflection. Power, once absolute, had consumed itself. And in that quiet collapse, the story of America's most secret government reached its final act. When the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, many believed the mafia had vanished. The great dons were dead or imprisoned, their empires shattered, their codes betrayed. But in truth, the story of the Italo-American Mafia didn't end with handcuffs. It simply went underground, adapting once again to the changing world. New York City, the stage where it all began, still carries its ghosts. You can't walk its streets without passing the invisible traces of the five families, the quiet remnants of an empire that once ruled the city like a kingdom in the shadows. The mafia, at its core, was never just a criminal enterprise. It was a culture, a way of seeing power, loyalty, and survival in a world that offered none of those things to its immigrants. Even after the commission crumbled, the old logic lingered. Power is protection, and silence is safety. The men who once filled smoky social clubs in Brooklyn and Little Italy may be gone, but their influence remains, buried in real estate portfolios, labor unions, trucking companies, and construction firms that still carry the faint fingerprints of organized crime. By the early 2000s, the FBI declared the five families weakened but not dead. Their structure had changed. Smaller crews, less centralized leadership, a move toward financial crimes rather than street-level violence. The killings that once made headlines had become rare, but the manipulation continued in subtler forms. The modern mafia no longer needed to rule through fear. It ruled through contracts, shell corporations, and silent partnerships. The methods evolved, but the mentality, the pursuit of invisible power, remained intact. Walk through neighborhoods like Bensonhurst, Howard Beach, or Staten Island, and you'll still hear whispers of connected guys, men who move quietly, keep their heads down, and know who to call when something needs to disappear. The old rituals, the blood oath, the kiss on the cheek, the candlelit initiation, still happen, though rarely and in secret. There are still bosses, underbosses, and capos. But their meetings are in parking lots, restaurants with no cameras, and back rooms guarded by silence rather than soldiers. The mafia has traded Tommy guns for smartphones, muscle for money laundering, but the hierarchy, the sacred structure Luciano created, endures. And then there's the mythology, the legend that refuses to die. For decades, Hollywood turned the mafia into America's dark mirror. Films like The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Irishman immortalized their codes and their charisma. Audiences admired their discipline, their loyalty, their sense of family. But that admiration was built on illusion. The real mafia wasn't noble, it was pragmatic. It corrupted cities, destroyed lives, and thrived on fear. Yet the myth persists because it speaks to something deeper in human nature. The hunger for belonging, the temptation of power, and the romance of rebellion. In that way, the mafia outlived itself. It became an archetype, a story America tells about its own underworld. Still, for all the cultural fascination, the consequences are real. The mafia's legacy reshaped New York's economy and politics in ways few people realize. It controlled the construction boom of the 20th century, rigged union elections, and fixed prices on everything from fish markets to cement contracts. It altered the very DNA of the city's industries. Even now, decades later, certain companies and unions bear silent connections to those old networks. The corruption isn't overt anymore, it's institutionalized. The system learned to live with the infection. The FBI continues to monitor the remnants, occasionally unsealing indictments that sound like echoes from another century. Names like the Teflon Don have been replaced by nicknames no one remembers. But the cycle continues: arrests, silence, replacements. The five families still exist: Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. Though smaller and less violent, they remain functional. The Genovese family, ever disciplined, is often called the Ivy League of organized crime for its ability to adapt. The Gambinos, despite Gotti's fall, still operate in various business sectors. They no longer need to rule the city. They only need to survive within it. The irony is that the mafia's downfall also marked its greatest victory. It became part of the system it once defied. Many of its former territories, construction, sanitation, real estate, remain governed by the same unspoken codes of favoritism and influence. The players changed, but the game stayed the same. New York still moves according to hidden interests, backroom deals, and silent agreements. The mafia didn't die. It dissolved into the bloodstream of the city it helped build. But for those who lived through its golden years, the scars never faded. The families of victims, the business owners who paid protection, the men who disappeared and were never found. They remember. In some neighborhoods, older residents still lower their voices when mentioning certain names. Fear has turned to superstition, but the instinct remains. You don't talk about them. The ghosts of Omerta still haunt the sidewalks, invisible but ever present. And then there's the paradox that defines the mafia's legacy. It was born out of poverty and injustice, yet became an engine of both. It offered protection to the powerless, but demanded absolute obedience. It gave structure to chaos, yet built that structure on blood. The same values that made it powerful, loyalty, honor, and silence, ultimately destroyed it. In the end, the mafia wasn't undone by the law alone, but by its own code. When the world changed, it could not. Today, the mafia's influence has spread in new directions: cybercrime, international drug routes, financial fraud. But none of it holds the same romance as the smoky social clubs of Little Italy. The men who once ruled New York's underworld have been replaced by anonymous figures behind computer screens. The brutality remains, but the mythology is gone. What's left is a whisper, a warning, that even in a city as bright as New York, there are always shadows deep enough to hide an empire. The legacy of the Italo-American Mafia is not merely about crime. It's about power, how it's gained, used, and lost. It's about the human need for control in a world that offers none. It's about the cost of silence and the illusion of loyalty. And perhaps most haunting of all, it's about how easily corruption can disguise itself as order. The five families may no longer rule the streets, but their ghostly presence lingers in every deal made in the dark, every favor exchanged without words, every truth that stays unspoken. As the city lights flicker across the East River, the empire that once ruled from the shadows is now part of history. But history has a way of breathing. In the quiet corners of New York, where old men sip espresso and speak in half sentences, the legend lives on. The kingdom built on fear and family may have fallen, but its echoes still whisper through the alleys, through the stories, through the bloodlines. The mafia never truly disappears. It only changes its name. They ruled New York from the shadows, and even now, their echoes remain. The mafia's story isn't just about crime, it's about power, loyalty, and the price of silence. If you want to uncover more hidden empires and forgotten truths, subscribe now and join us on this journey into the world that lives behind the headlines. Every week, we reveal another chapter history tried to bury. Don't look away, because in every city and every secret, the past